December 1944. The cold winter sky over Germany was a death trap, filled with flak and Messerschmitt fighters, a place where American bombers flew into hell every day, knowing some wouldn't make it home. Captain Robert "Bob" Lawson gripped the controls of his B-17 flying fortress, a beast of a plane nicknamed Liberty Bell, as they approached the target deep in enemy territory. The mission was simple on paper: bomb the industrial complex at Schweinfurt, cripple German war production, and get back to England before the fighters caught them. Simple, except nothing about war in the air was ever simple. Bob's crew was 10 men strong, each one trained to perfection, each one knowing that survival depended on teamwork, luck, and the grace of God. The bombardier, Lieutenant Jimmy Carson from Texas, was hunched over his bomb sight in the nose, calculating angles and trajectories, while flak burst around them like angry fists. The navigator, Sergeant Paul Hendricks, was checking maps and calling out corrections, his voice steady despite the chaos. In the waist gunners' positions, young men barely out of high school manned the .50 caliber machine guns, scanning the sky for enemy fighters. The tail gunner, Corporal Eddie Murphy, had the loneliest job of all, sitting in the cramped tail section, watching their six, knowing that if a fighter came in from behind, he was the first and last line of defense. And up in the cockpit, Bob and his co-pilot, Lieutenant Frank Miller, worked in perfect synchronization, calling out readings, adjusting throttles, keeping the big plane steady as anti-aircraft fire exploded all around them. The sky was black with flak, puffs of smoke that looked harmless from a distance, but could tear a plane apart in an instant. A direct hit could vaporize a bomber, turning 4 engines and 10 men into a fireball that fell from the sky like a dying star. Near misses sent shrapnel tearing through aluminum skin, shredding control cables, puncturing fuel tanks, and wounding or killing crew members. Bob had seen it all before on previous missions, had watched friends die in burning planes, had heard the desperate calls over the radio as crippled bombers fell out of formation and spiraled down into the clouds below. But today was going to be different. Today, everything that could go wrong would go wrong, and Bob Lawson would face a test that would push him and his crew to the absolute limit of human endurance and courage. The bomb run began at exactly 1400 hours as the formation turned onto the final approach, the lead bombardier calling out over the radio to hold steady, stay in formation, don't break until bombs away. Liberty Bell shuddered as flak bursts rocked the plane, and Bob fought the controls to keep her level. Jimmy's voice came over the intercom, calm and focused, despite the hell around them, calling out adjustments, then finally the words every pilot wanted to hear: bombs away. The plane lurched upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosive fell away, and Bob immediately banked to the left to get out of the flak zone as fast as possible. But that's when the fighters hit them. Focke-Wulf 190s came screaming out of the sun, their cannons blazing, and the sky erupted into a maelstrom of tracers and explosions. The waist gunners opened up, their .50s hammering away, and Eddie in the tail was shouting contacts and firing long bursts at the Germans diving in from behind. One FW-190 made a head-on pass, and Bob saw the winking flashes of its guns a split second before cannon shells ripped into Liberty Bell's nose section. The plexiglass shattered, and Jimmy's voice cut off mid-sentence. Frank was shouting something, but Bob couldn't hear over the roar of wind and engines and gunfire. Another fighter came in from the side, and more shells tore into the fuselage, puncturing through the thin aluminum skin like it was paper. The number 3 engine exploded in a gout of flame and smoke, and Bob immediately hit the feathering switch to stop the propeller from windmilling and tearing itself apart. 3 engines could still get them home if they could just survive the next few minutes. But then the number 4 engine started smoking, hit by shrapnel from another fighter pass, and Bob knew they were in serious trouble. 2 engines out on the same wing meant they were going to have trouble maintaining altitude, and they were still deep over enemy territory with a long way to go before they reached friendly lines. Frank was calling out damage reports as they came in over the intercom. Nose section destroyed, bombardier down, possibly dead, top turret gunner wounded, right waist gunner killed instantly by a cannon shell, oxygen system damaged, hydraulics failing. The list went on, each report worse than the last, and Bob realized with cold clarity that Liberty Bell was dying. The fighters made another pass, and this time a burst of cannon fire tore through the cockpit itself. Frank screamed and slumped forward in his seat, blood spraying across the instrument panel, and Bob felt something hot punch through his left shoulder, but there was no time to think about it, no time to do anything except keep flying. He reached over and pulled Frank back, saw the grievous wound in his co-pilot's chest, and knew there was nothing he could do. Frank's eyes met his for just a second, a look of surprise and regret, and then he was gone. Bob was alone now in the cockpit of a dying bomber, 2 engines out, controls barely responding, crew members dead or wounded, and still 150 miles from the relative safety of Allied lines. The rational thing to do would be to give the order to bail out, let the crew take their chances with parachutes and German captivity rather than ride the plane down to a certain death. But Bob looked down at the scattered farms and villages below and knew that if Liberty Bell crashed there, she would take innocent civilians with her. The plane was carrying a full load of ammunition for the guns, and if she went in hard, the explosion would level everything around her. He made a decision that would define the rest of his life, assuming he had a rest of his life. He was going to get this plane home or die trying. He keyed the intercom and spoke to his crew, his voice calm despite the chaos, telling them to hang on, telling them they were going to make it, telling them to trust him. And then he pointed Liberty Bell's shattered nose toward England and began the longest flight of his life. With only 2 engines running, and both on the left wing, the plane wanted to roll to the right constantly, and Bob had to fight the controls every second just to keep her level. The hydraulics were gone, which meant no power assist for the control surfaces, and moving the yoke felt like trying to bend steel bars with his bare hands. His wounded shoulder screamed with pain every time he moved, blood soaking through his flight suit, but he gritted his teeth and kept flying. The crew did what they could to help, throwing out everything that wasn't nailed down to lighten the plane. Guns, ammunition, equipment, even personal items. They needed every bit of altitude they could get because they were losing height steadily, dropping 100 feet every few minutes, and if they couldn't maintain at least 1,000 feet, they'd never clear the mountains between them and home. Paul, the navigator, was calling out courses and landmarks, his voice hoarse from the thin air since the oxygen system was shot, and the remaining gunners were watching for more fighters, knowing they had no ammunition left to fight back if the Germans came again. But luck or divine providence was with them, because the fighters didn't return, perhaps thinking Liberty Bell was already doomed and not worth the ammunition. The minutes stretched into hours as they limped across occupied France, every second an eternity, every mile a small victory. Bob's vision was starting to blur from blood loss, and he knew he was going into shock, but he couldn't let go of the controls, couldn't stop flying even for a second. The crew was depending on him, the guys who were still alive anyway, and he wasn't going to let them down. They crossed into Allied territory just as the sun was setting, the sky turning blood red on the horizon, and Bob thought it was appropriate somehow. A crimson sky for a day soaked in blood. The English coast appeared in the distance, a thin, dark line against the gray ocean, and Bob felt a surge of hope that maybe, just maybe, they were going to pull this off. But then the number 2 engine coughed and died, fuel starvation from a punctured tank, and they were down to 1 engine. 1 engine on a 4-engine bomber meant they were a glider now, falling slowly but inevitably toward the earth. Bob called the nearest airfield, a small fighter base in southern England, and declared an emergency. The controller's voice came back immediately, professional and calm, clearing them for landing, asking if they needed ambulances. Bob almost laughed at that, a bitter sound that hurt his throat, because of course they needed ambulances. They needed morgue wagons too, probably. He lined up on the runway as best he could with the crippled controls, fighting the plane every inch of the way, and the crew braced for impact. The landing gear wouldn't come down because the hydraulics were dead, so they were going to belly land, scraping in on the plane's aluminum skin at over 100 miles per hour. Bob told everyone to hold tight, and then he cut the last engine and brought Liberty Bell down. They hit hard, the whole plane shuddering and shrieking as metal scraped across concrete, sparks flying. And for a terrible moment, Bob thought they were going to flip over or explode, but somehow they held together. The plane skidded for what felt like miles, tearing itself apart, pieces flying off in all directions, and then, finally, blessedly, they stopped. Silence. Bob sat in the ruined cockpit, hands still gripping the yoke, not quite believing they were on the ground and alive. Behind him he could hear groans and curses as the crew started moving, checking themselves for injuries, helping each other out of the wreckage. Emergency vehicles were racing toward them, sirens wailing, and Bob thought distantly that he should probably get out of the plane before it caught fire, but he couldn't seem to make his body move. Someone climbed up into the cockpit, a medic maybe, and gently pried his hands off the controls, and only then did Bob let himself collapse. He woke up in a hospital 3 days later, his shoulder bandaged, and his body feeling like it had been put through a meat grinder. A doctor told him he'd nearly died from blood loss and shock, that it was a miracle he'd stayed conscious long enough to land the plane. They told him about his crew. Jimmy, the bombardier, was dead, killed instantly when the fighters hit the nose. Frank, the co-pilot, was dead. The right waist gunner was dead. 3 others were wounded but would survive. 4 men had walked away without a scratch. Out of 10, that was better than it could have been. But Bob couldn't help thinking about the ones who didn't make it, the guys who trusted him to get them home. A week later, they took him to see what was left of Liberty Bell. The plane was a total loss, barely recognizable as a B-17, more than half of it shot away or torn apart. Engineers and mechanics stood around scratching their heads, unable to understand how Bob had kept it in the air, let alone flown it for 2 hours across enemy territory and landed it. One old sergeant with 30 years in the Air Force looked at the wreckage and then at Bob and said simply, "Son, you've got iron in your blood." Bob was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Purple Heart, and his crew received their own medals and commendations. But the real reward was simpler and more profound. They had survived. They had faced the worst that war could throw at them, and they had come through it, battered and bloody, but alive. Bob flew more missions after he recovered, eventually completing his tour and going home to a hero's welcome. He married his sweetheart, had kids, lived a long and productive life. But he never forgot that day over Germany, never forgot the feel of Liberty Bell's controls under his hands, never forgot his crew's faith in him. He never forgot Frank's last look or Jimmy's voice cutting off in mid-sentence. Those memories stayed with him, sharp and clear, for the rest of his days. The story of Bob Lawson and Liberty Bell became legend in the 8th Air Force, a tale told and retold in ready rooms and barracks, a reminder of what courage and determination could accomplish. It was a story about a pilot who refused to give up, who flew a half-destroyed plane through hell and brought his crew home. It was a story about iron will and the unbreakable spirit of men who fought for freedom in the darkest days of the war. Years later, when Bob was an old man and the war was ancient history, someone asked him how he'd done it, how he'd kept flying when any sane person would have bailed out. Bob thought about it for a long moment, looking back across the decades to that blood-red sunset over England, and finally he said, "I just couldn't let them down. My boys were counting on me, and I couldn't let them down." That was all there was to it, really. No grand speeches, no complex philosophy, just a simple truth that defined the generation. They couldn't let each other down. And because of that, because of countless men like Bob Lawson, who refused to quit no matter how bad things got, they won the war. That's the story of Iron Will, the B-17 pilot who landed with half a plane and no hope. It's a story worth remembering, worth passing down to future generations, because it reminds us of what human beings are capable of when they refuse to surrender to despair. Bob Lawson and his crew were ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances, and they rose to meet the challenge with courage and determination that still inspires us today.